I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
Hello everyone, Dr. James Boswell returns to the show to discuss the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which he's been covering on his Wall of Controversy blog. I start out by asking James about when he first started paying attention to Ukraine as a country during the revolution of 2014.
I was thinking about this, yesterday, like before, coming on, like thinking, what was I thinking at this time, and it occurred to me that a lot of the information I was getting was coming from Webster Tarpley, who I'm sure you followed.
Yes, historically, yeah. I have one of his books on 9/11 synthetic terror.
Yes, which was, I mean, I don't know, I've not read it, but it was almost considered, the sort of the acme of books about 9/11, wasn't it?
Acme of books. I don't. What is? I mean, I know what acme is, but
sorry, like the highest expression of, or something.
Oh right. I know some people, like a copy was given to me for the cost of £1 by someone who was selling them and thought it was so good that they were certainly describing it as the best book of 9/11 and selling it at this ridiculous discounted price because they were keen to get it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was getting good reviews, from even mainstream, I think, to some extent. And of course, sorry, we're going a bit off track, but basically Tarpley focused on the drills of 9/11. That was his, and he was very much a specialist on false flag events. And at the time, he was very much a familiar figure, in these areas.
No, just I'm just going to check that the aesthetic of that book. He actually put the pictures of the 19 hijackers up alongside pictures of the plotters of the gunpowder plot in the 17th century, the Blue Parliament, and he was drawing an historical comparison of both of them, both sets of men being patsies to allow for imperial expansion. So the gunpowder plot was what allowed for the consolidation of British power and the oppression domestically of Catholics, and then leading into the expansion into the British Empire. And Tarpley saying the same thing about 9/11, that it's domestic oppression and the blaming of not Catholics but Muslims abroad to justify this crusade in the Middle East. So that was his thesis of it, of false flags running through history.
Yeah, well, I've heard Tarpley talk about the gunpowder plot. I jokingly sometimes called it 5/11. On that basis.
Very good.
It's interesting, how the debate on these things is so closed down. If you go on to, sort of Wikipedia, which is, notoriously bad for this sort of stuff, but you look up gunpowder plot, an event that happened, what is it? I don't know, 400 years ago or something. And you can't even get a discussion of that side of the events, even centuries later, sort of suppressed.
But I think it was a Catholic that wrote a book about it sometime after, looking at it from that angle of being a British government false flag or an English government false flag. And I think what struck me as interesting was the suppression of discussion around it at the time, which maybe that's not that surprising for the 17th century, but that it did enter into the English mythos and that it was like a compulsory celebration. Bonfire Night was really a state event for a long period afterwards.
The parallels with 9/11 are fair enough, I think, in a way. In that sense, again, that 9/11 is this major event in, well, certainly American history, arguably world history. And, so one of these things that we must never forget, that, like you say, led to kind of a religious, enemy, or not led to it, but, framed up a religious enemy for political purposes. So it was Tarpley who was talking about the events in Ukraine. He was one of the first people talking about it, really. And he basically was saying quite openly on his World Crisis Radio show, his weekly show, he was covering it, and he was basically saying, look, this is getting out of hand. And he was calling Yanukovych to clamp down on what he was already basically calling a coup, really, I suppose, or about, and he was calling out the protesters for not being these sort of liberal-minded protesters that we were being told. Certainly not throughout, and that that there was this contingent within it that was extremely far right, that it got this history going back to the Second World War and collaboration with the Nazis and so on. And all that was new to me, to be honest. Obviously, I started looking into it and following it at that point, really. Yeah, and then it really kicked off with the massacre. I mean, it's, as far as I'm aware, it's still not, and probably never will be entirely resolved, who was firing the shots at the crowd.
No, it's contested between the Ukrainian government was doing it to suppress the protests, or right-wing nationalist elements were doing it because they were seen leaving the square carrying musical instruments in large cases.
Yeah.
So we wanted that, and there has been analysis done of the shooting patterns and everything, which is quite difficult for the average person to decipher. But yeah, that they're the two competing groups. It does seem like on the who benefits side of it, that the right-wing nationalists, I heard good cases that they were behind at least some of the shooting going on in the Maidan Square.
Absolutely, and a parallel case that springs to mind. I don't know if you know about the events in Venezuela. I think it was 2002.
Yeah, where the Bush government attempted to overthrow Hugo Chavez.
That's right, and that was sparked by these sort of random shootings on a protest, where they were crossing a bridge, and it transpired that was definitely a false flag. I mean, it was basically being blamed on either pro-Chavez people or the police. I can't quite remember now, and it was used as an excuse for this already in the works takeover, military-led takeover by basically kind of business guy type person.
Yeah, it's a consistent theme, right? And the thing in Venezuela got very well exposed, but Webster Tarpley, whatever you think of him as a researcher or don't think of him as a researcher, he's a brave guy. Like, he went to Syria when it all kicked off there in 2011. And one of the things he was reporting back was that there were these strange assassinations going on where people were just being randomly shot from rooftops. And I recall the same thing in Iran. I think it was 2009 when they had the Green movement there. And there was a particular woman who became kind of the face of that because she was shot. But when you looked at the detail, she was shot like nowhere near the protest, doing nothing to do with it whatsoever, and just randomly shot from a rooftop somewhere. So there are these strange assassinations that go on around these movements that are tied into it, but aren't necessarily what they appear on the surface.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Exactly. Again, I mean, it's controversial, but again, there is evidence that was done deliberately to provoke essentially a kind of civil war, really, I suppose. I think you could say much the same in Ukraine, really. It does appear that it was done deliberately by these right-wing factions to essentially, what it did was kick off a civil war, really. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels, I think.
Yeah, and I think people have generally been unaware of the level of violence that kicked off at that time, where of the 14,000 people who estimated died between 2014 and the official start of the war, the majority of them were in that early period, in the 2014 to 15 period.
Yeah, you're talking about the civilians in Donbass now.
Yeah.
So basically, we had this moment in Kiev where, let's put it this way, right? One of these right-wing leaders has more recently, his name is Yevhen Karas, and he's like the head of these kind of black shirt C-14 gangs, they're called. And he's come out and he said, if it wasn't for people like us, essentially, the Maidan, the Euromaidan, as it was called then, would have been, and this is his words, a gay parade or gay rights parade, i.e. was going nowhere politically, and we essentially hijacked it. And he's very proud of that, of course. And I think without a doubt, that's easy to see that's basically what happened, was that it started out as a lot of the people on the streets were in favor of the European Union and so on, hence the Euromaidan. They got their flags and so on, and they were looking west. I mean, Ukraine's a very divided country. Since its modern formation, it's always been sort of east-west divide. The western side of it looking west, and the eastern side of it feeling more Russian. And these people were basically feeling like, we want to move towards Europe. And then you got this other faction, which was, a very significant presence, and a very brutal presence of a mix of different. I mean, there's not just one set of ultra nationalists, as they're called in our media, in these protests and within these Ukrainian political groups. You got Svoboda, which is a party that was formerly called the Social Nationalist Party. So there's a kind of clue in the name there, I think. And its original symbol was a Wolfsangel, which is that kind of variant of a swastika, basically. And they were, in a way, kind of the more moderate political force in the right-wing faction of the Maidan protests. And then alongside them, you'd got Pravy sector, right sector, which was run by Dmitry Yarosh. And these guys were like stormtroopers or something. They were just paramilitary group. And they were very much leading, as far as I could see anyway, they were very much leading the sort of the violence against the police and so on. There was a lot of setting light to buildings and stuff, wasn't there?
Well, famously in Odessa, a bunch of people were basically murdered by being pushed into a building.
Yes, that comes after, doesn't it? I think you have the coup, and these people basically gain power. So the leaders of all these parties and groups and so on, they actually get into parliament at that point. So you see who are the beneficiaries of this event, and they are very much these ultranationalist groups. Basically, they gain an enormous amount of power at that moment. And then you get this massacre that happens in Odessa, where people in Odessa which I think is more Russian friendly, and the Maidan people were protesting there and basically got herded into a trade union building and surrounded by these ultranationalists who torched the building. And I mean, this is on film and stuff, so
yeah, it's not ambiguous, although the Western media, including the BBC, were very reluctant to report it unambiguously at the time. They say, well, something happened, we don't really know. There was even a report of an eyewitness seeing someone inside the building try and throw a Molotov cocktail out and it bouncing back off the pane of glass. That seems like the most incredibly unlikely explanation for the whole thing. It was actually ridiculous. But there was this reticence to blame Ukrainian nationalists in the Western media at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely preposterous. That carries on. I mean, if you type in Odessa massacre into Wikipedia, it redirects you automatically, and what you get is Odessa clashes,
right?
Which is incredible when you think about it. Clashes.
Yeah.
I mean, like, whatever you think this is, it's a massacre, right? 46 people died in that building.
It's such a pivotal point as well, because it's what is meant to have really scared the people in eastern Ukraine into greater levels of resistance. Thanks. So, hang on, this is going to happen to us.
Absolutely, without question. I think it's clear that happened, and understandably. I mean, one of the things that I find so puzzling about this, really, because I have followed it closely, is that most of the liberals I know, and that's most of the people I know, I tend to know liberal people, they just don't get this. They don't seem somehow to be able to put themselves in the shoes of these people in the eastern parts of Ukraine who are now being targeted basically in a variety of ways, and quite literally in the case of these people in Odessa. How can you not see that it makes sense for them to try and get away somehow, whether that be literally get away, and lots of people became refugees. I believe 1 million refugees from Donbass fled to Russia during this time, or to politically get away in some sense and have these referenda, which I think happened in the 2 regions of Donbass, but also happened in, I think, Mariupol and in Crimea. You don't have to believe that the results of these referenda are, an absolutely accurate reflection of view. I mean, it'd be very hard, I think, under the circumstances, to conduct a truly accurate poll, even if you wanted to. But I don't think there's any question that these people were genuinely terrified about what was going on and desperate to escape.
Well, it would be akin to the British government in response to Bloody Friday, just shelling Catholic areas of Belfast and Derry okay, and killing like 10,000 people.
Yeah, you
If you
mean
think about it, that's the comparative. Like, so obviously, Bloody Sunday was a terrible massacre, but it was in the tens of people there. There were others of similar quantity at the time, but the Ukrainian government gets a pass for killing over 10,000 of its own people.
so? Yeah, I mean, after these particularly the two regions of Donbass, after they declared their independence, obviously Poroshenko, who'd come to power president, basically, encouraged and armed these ultranationalists to go and one of which is the famed Azov battalion, to fight these separatists, as they were called. So yeah, like you say, it's like they started shelling their own people. In a sense, it's a civil war, but to my mind, it's very clear, as with the Irish conflict, who's really the aggressor in this. And I can't see how you can think it's the people of the Donbass who were doing anything really other than trying to defend themselves from a very nasty uprising of ultranationalism that had a history of quite literally outdoing the Nazis in terms of its atrocities during the Second World War.
And that was quite acceptable to talk about right up until the outbreak of the war. It was quite acceptable for mainstream media to talk about Ukraine's far right problem and the history of the far right in Ukraine, and how far right leaders like Stefan Bandera would still have their faces on banners being paraded through the streets. And it seemed to become like a totally verboten topic as soon as the war broke out.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And of course, ever since, what they've done is they've basically created this illusion that somehow if you talk about these things, it makes you a Putinist or a pro-Russian propagandist or something. It's just more evidence of how easily they can stifle debate in the West, which is we've supposedly got free press and so on, and yet we can't openly discuss the blatantly obvious, really. So we will have situations where I can remember Channel 4 News, Matt Fry, isn't it? Matt Fry. He went and interviewed Dmitry Yarosh, if I remember correctly. Now, he was the leader of the right sector, so he's a militant ultranationalist, I'm being polite, and he just basically gives him a softball interview, barely really asks him what he actually stands for. He's given him a platform, essentially. There was another one where a BBC reporter was embedded with the Azov battalion, didn't tell you who the Azov battalion are, didn't tell you that at that time they were operating under a badge that's got not only the Volksangle, which it still has, but also the Black Sun, which is a Nazi symbol that I think you find in Castle Wewelsburg. There's one on the floor, I think, isn't there? It's obviously there's a sort of a cultist side to the Nazis. So these people have resurrected this bizarre symbol and put it on their flag. There's no question what they are about, and yet somehow the media in the West has been neutralized, really, or whatever. I don't know. I don't know why they refuse. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Really, that you can't talk about outright Nazism when you see it.
Well, I think the feeling was coming out of the COVID era when this all kicked off, and you see like the profiles of "I've had my you know what" and the masked faces on Facebook switch seamlessly over to the blue and yellow, and then the retort to that from the nonconformist was the "I'm for the current thing" badges put up on Facebook, just recognizing this shift had taken place, about the new thing that had this religious significance behind it, the new crusade that we were all to get behind, where questions of morality were absolutely crystal clear and there was no need to discuss the rights and wrongs of anything, or what may or may not be efficacious in lowering the level of violence. And it was just a seamless transition almost. And to me, I can certainly understand why intelligent minds might differ on the subject of COVID, right? Like, it's not like any of us spent a lot of time thinking about virology prior to 2020, unless you're one of the people that did. But Ukraine seemed like that much simpler to me to understand that wars have many fathers, and it's clearly, you know, Putin might not be a good guy, but he's not the only not good guy in this whole equation. And this very simplistic way of thinking about the whole thing, with the harking back to Adolf Hitler and so on, I was quite surprised how that took, not only was present, but how it took over. And even, I suppose, because Putin is the ostensible aggressor in this, that seemed to be enough to neutralize criticism.
Yeah, very true. But it goes back. If you go back to 2014, because I was talking about this in 2014 with, you know, where I work, and I still remember a colleague there, you know, intelligent guy, was doing a PhD in physics or whatever. I'd said to him, we were talking about what was going on at the start of the war, when, if you remember at the time, they were already talking about a Russian invasion. See, that's been forgotten now, but they were, when it clearly wasn't. And I was basically saying it's not a Russian invasion. You know, that's not what's happened. I sort of drew attention to these ultra nationalist groups, including, I think, Azov. And, you know, I basically said to him, you know, how can you basically stand on the side of these Nazis? And he said, and I more or less quote, "I'd rather be a Nazi than a Russian." And it just stopped me in my tracks, because I thought, I don't understand it. I don't understand how you can reach a mindset like that, really. I mean, like, when I've basically presented you with the evidence, and rather than refute my evidence, your stance is just to take the side of something that I thought we'd all agreed was basically the greatest evil in modern history.
Yeah, I've noticed that there is some, it affects people on some psychological way. And the way COVID affected people in a deeply psychological way and spoke to primal fears of viruses, I think this situation has another kind of effect of barbarians at the gate. Like, there is a kind of inherent anti-Russian racism underpinning a lot of what's gone on, right, in this, of the idea that these hordes from the east are going to pour into Fortress Europe, and they're ruining this civilization we've built up here. They're not playing by the rules of civilization.
It's staggering, isn't it, really? I find it staggering because I've always had a certain kind of sympathy towards Russia, because, well, partly just because I love its culture. Just personally, I love the culture that came out of Germany first, if you like, and then Russia second. You know, I think they're the two most amazing countries in a way in the world. So, you know, I find it hard to understand this kind of antipathy towards Russia. Oh, certainly in the Western world, this antipathy towards Russia, and I never have understood it, really. I never understood it as a kid when I lived through the Cold War. But the Cold War was much more sane than this, because there was an ideology, and clearly horrible things had taken place in the Soviet Union. I never believed for a minute that the Soviet Union had any intention of rolling its tanks into Western Europe, but people really did. I mean, it's kind of like that now. We have basically recreated the same mindset, but in such a peculiar way, because there really isn't actually any difference now between Russia and the West. You know, politically, hardly at all. And what's the significant difference, really? That they supposedly don't like gay rights as much as we do, or something like this. I mean, this is incredibly minor scale compared to, you know, the idea that, like, one group is capitalist and the other group is communist.
Yeah, there's not the same economic division. I don't think there's any really noticeable one. I think, see, I would say, like, the economic structure of society is really the important thing, far beyond whether you have a democracy or a monarchy or anything else, because the economic structure is what's going to determine whether you can put food on your plate and a roof over your head and that kind of thing, and not whether your great leader is called prime minister, president, or king. But I think actually that's not the general perception. Okay, because we make a kind of religion out of government. And therefore, there is this idea that the most important thing about your country is not how the economy's run, it's about, do you have a democracy or not? And Russia is seen as having only a very ostensible democracy, because you have Putin, who has become like a czar-like figure. And there's maybe some truth in that in terms of assassinations of political opponents and his continued reign in power. So I don't think Russia is seen as having transitioned to the lofty heights of democracy which we in the West have achieved. Now that you know, in real money, that might be garbage, right? It might not be worth anything. But that's why I think there is this continued kind of looking down upon the East on on the level of the population. And geopolitically, the way I conceived of this from the start, I'm actually just doing a podcast episode on the Russian Revolution at the moment, but I just think ever since the French armies were turned back, Russia has been sort of stepped onto the European board as a major player. It took the land to the north, previously under Peter the Great, where Sevastopol is now, and then Catherine the Great went down and took the Crimea, and Russia had access to ports for the first time, and it became, and through the colonization of the East, so when the British Empire is essentially colonizing the United States, what became the United States, Russia is colonizing all of Siberia, and it becomes this massive, it steps onto the European board as a massive power player, and Western powers have just periodically needed to tame the bear. So you see that in the Crimean War. You see it when they use the British ally of the Japanese to use them as a proxy force to keep Russian ambitions in the Far East in check. And then during the First World War, they kind of played off against Germany. Whatever role the Western powers did or didn't have in the Russian Revolution, the communists come in, and that really cripples the Russian economy in a way it cannot compete with Britain and the United States then in terms of economic power for the rest of the 20th century. And then you see it again in Afghanistan, using the Mujahideen as a proxy force to bring down the Soviet Empire. And I shouldn't miss out with what the Harvard economist went in did in ripping apart the Russian economy during the 90s to pillage as much as possible. So I just think we were kind of due another round of the taming of the bear, and Ukraine seems to be it. Because it's much easier. You don't really want a direct confrontation of Russia. It's too big and powerful for that. So you want to ideally use somebody else to do the fighting.
Yeah, that's a good summary. I think you missed out. I would say you missed out Hitler.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
because he was bankrolled by the Americans and sort of supported by us as well, to some extent, to do the same job. Really.
Yeah, you could look at the wars that way. I mean, I'm going through the First World War at the minute and looking really at the Perfidious Albion theory that the British were much more nefarious and involved in getting the whole thing going. And you could see it that way, right? You could see it as Britain ostensibly being allied with Russia, but really setting Russia and Germany against each other to neutralize their two major political opponents, imperial opponents.
Well, that's very much the way Tarpley would look at it. Going back to Tarpley, I mean, he had a theory that basically the British would always play off, they were the top empire and they'd always play off numbers 2 and 3.
Yeah, and I'm cautious about interpreting people's intentions in history based on what worked out. So irrespective of what people intended at that time, that is what worked out. That's how it played out. This continuous demolition job on Russia.
I mean, my feeling, I'm not claiming to know a lot about this history at all, but my feeling from having looked into it is that basically the Hitler and the Nazis in Germany were a project that got out of hand, really. They became a threat to the empire itself, having been kind of used as a cat's paw by the empire to, as you say, keep down a competitor. So like you say, you can't, when you're playing these sort of games, you can't always know what the outcome's going to be. So you end up fighting your own proxy, essentially. I mean, the same thing in principle could happen here if it got out of hand, really, because in many ways, we're dealing with similar kind of ideology, and there is an ideology in this ultranationalism.
Well, that is an interesting point, right? Because it wouldn't be the only time, as you say, if that theory is true of the Nazis, and it is something I find quite compelling and interesting. But it's certainly the case with the Mujahideen and ultimately the Taliban. That of course, it's comical to look back at the films like Rambo 3 from the 1980s, how they're supporting the brave freedom fighters in Afghanistan, and Ronald Reagan talking and giving his glowing assessments of these men are freedom fighters.
Do you remember Sandy Gall?
No.
Oh, perhaps you're too young. I don't
remember Sandy Gall, no.
So 10 o'clock news, ITV, when that was happening, Sandy Gall would be out there, if I remember right, it was Sandy Gall, praising to the heights these rebels fighting off the Soviet oppressors. And they would tell you, and even as a kid, I could feel that this was wrong, and he'd basically be saying, they're making these Russians read the Quran, on the pain of death, basically. And it's like, how the hell can that be good?
I remember being kids, and we were into action films. We weren't into geopolitics, but we were into action films and Sylvester Stallone. And then a friend of mine commented, yeah, that Rocky 3 thing, I'm not too sure about that. They're supporting the Islamic fanatics that are the Taliban. That, yeah, it's a bit of a strange one, that. And we were only like 12 years old, but even we sort of saw there could be a problem here. And so what you've got is I think 23-year turnaround from the US involvement there. Not even that, really. They were still supporting the Taliban after that. From being active supporters. What am I talking about? 23. I've grossly exaggerated that. More like a 15-year turnaround between, if not even that, between active support to out and out war. So what that would imply then, if you follow the logic, at some point in the 2030s, the United States is going to invade Ukraine to put down the Azov Battalion neo-Nazis after major terrorist incidents in the United States. I mean, is that the dark future we're looking into?
Well, it could be, couldn't it? I mean, obviously these Islamist groups are, run by people like Bin Laden. We know that they were CIA operated groups. We know that Zbigniew Brzezinski was behind the scenes, getting it all going. But I think we also know that their progress into the Middle East and what they've been doing in Syria is not entirely just them being bad eggs. We've obviously supported them to those ends as well. So we kind of use these people periodically. I suppose we used them in Libya as well, obviously to bring down Gaddafi. We got Timber Sycamore was the operation to back these so-called moderate rebels in Syria. So it's kind of hard to judge to what extent these people are rogue, I suppose, and to what extent we're just using them as covertly manipulating them as our cat's paw whenever we need to. And the same thing could happen potentially, regardless of how successful these Ukrainian nationalists are likely to be. And I think the answer to that is that they're not going to be very successful, because I don't think things are going very well for them. Certainly they look at it as an opportunity to spread their own ideology. They very much look at it like that. I've heard, again, that guy Yevhen Karas, I think it was, saying exactly that, basically, that this is our chance. And then there's the guy who formed the Azov Battalion, Beletsky, and he says, he's got that famous quote, Ukraine's mission is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen.
Right.
That's that's what some of these people really believe this. And of course, at the start of the Ukraine, the original battle for Donbass, lots of extreme right sympathizers basically flooded in to help these groups. Came in to help Azov and so on. I mean, Azov are only one as well. Of course, there's actually multiple of these extreme right-wing military groups that formed.
Yeah, you wonder how it could spread. One thing I wanted to ask, was like your sense of the accuracy of predictions about the conflict. Okay, the one podcast I did in this looked at everything up until the outbreak of the war, of the Russian invasion. So really establishing historical context. And then I don't know anything about military tactics, okay? But what I've come to conclude is that neither does anyone else by listening to people over the past year. Because I think it's true to say that a lot of people in the sort of libertarian anti-war movement kind of missed the invasion, in terms of like they were poo-pooing the idea that Putin was about to invade up until the point it happened. So that was actually, score one for the people who always think the sky is falling to begin with. Although it wasn't universally missed. Like Stephen Cohen in his book, War of Russia, ? Did predict that this was going to be the way it could potentially play out. There was going to be an escalating conflict with Russia over the idea of Ukraine either becoming a NATO member, either de facto or de jure. But looking at the predictions that have been made, obviously there's a whole bunch of predictions that Ukraine are always on the verge of victory and driving the Russians out, and it's going to be this one big offensive. And those predictions never worked out to be true. But equally, the kind of predictions made by the likes of Colonel Douglas Macgregor about the pincer movements and everything, the Russians are right on the verge of victory all the time. I've not really found like the predictions from the more kind of, I'm not going to say pro-Russian, but more sort of anti-NATO, anti-imperialist side to be accurate either. What's your sense of that?
Well, I'm in similar position to you in many ways. I've never claimed to know anything about this. I mean, to be honest, it's a subject I've tended to avoid really until now.
Mm.
Like some of these other people, I have to admit, I will confess straight up that I also was quite I didn't write about it, but I was very adamant that Russia were not about to invade in 2022 or last year. I thought that was just media hype, and then of course they proved us massively wrong.
Just to reflect on that, I mean,
Sure.
I wonder what your reasons for that were. My reasons were that it seemed like a very stupid thing to do, because the West would have absolutely no interest in bringing any end to the conflict, and it would be Afghanistan 2.0, and Putin is old enough, obviously, to remember Afghanistan, so obviously he's not going to want a rerun of that. The West would obviously channel weapons in to Ukraine, and then even if Putin took some sort of control of the country, they would just fill it full of Gladio-style proxy forces forever. So it didn't seem like a conflict that could be won to any Russian satisfaction.
Yeah, I thought much the same. I thought he wouldn't be stupid enough to
so
fall
that's what
into
we were
the
very
trap,
surprised by. It
basically,
was
what
my
you've
major
done.
reason to go, it's probably not going to happen. There's probably...
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it's easy for people who might be listening to this conversation thinking somehow we're on the side of Putin, because we're not taking the Western side. That's not the case. I'm just trying to judge it as I see it. I don't think, I don't assume that Putin's going to do the right thing or he's some good guy or something. I just think that what I don't think is he's an idiot, and there's no evidence to think he's an idiot. He seems quite a shrewd guy. So no, I didn't. My reason for thinking he wouldn't do it was that it didn't make sense to do it for all the reasons you're saying, that he would get himself into this quagmire and never get out of it. And to some extent, maybe that's the case. I still don't know. I mean, how do we ever get out of this now? And I also, to be honest, I think that Putin actually did misunderstand the intentions of the West, in the sense that I don't think he realized quite how crazy these neoconservatives, who have basically been, be pulling the strings ever since 2014, when Victoria Nuland went to the protest with her cookies, and John McCain, I think, was standing on stage with Oleg Tannenbach and all this kind of stuff. And they and Lindsey Graham's been out there, hasn't he? And all these people, basically, they're so vested in it, they put vast amounts of money into it, and they don't seem to have any idea of pulling out of basically what I see as, I mean, in their own terms, if you go back to the PNAC people and what they were saying in their rebuilding America's defenses, I think it was in there, that document, where they talk openly about American primacy, and I think they use the term Pax Americana and all this kind of stuff. They're basically talking about complete domination, full spectrum, I think, again, is one of their terms, full spectrum dominance of the world. Essentially, that's their ambition. Now, to reach that ambition, obviously, if Russia and China are not on board politically, so you can't kind of control them in that sense, and you have to take them out of the equation in some way. I think the reason why this all started was that these neocon faction, who sadly have embedded themselves into the heart of American politics ever since 9/11, and probably, well, sometime before, I guess, they see it as their mission to use whatever means they can to establish this global supremacy. And Brzezinski wrote about it, didn't he? In is it the Grand Chessboard?
Yeah, control of Eurasia, and
he talks specifically about Ukraine, I think, at one point, being the key place in terms of controlling Asia, I suppose, over the Soviet Union at the time.
Yeah, that's the only conclusion I could come to, is that Putin thought that he could force through the Minsk Accords or something, or some version of them, after an invasion. Like, he could get people to a table and actually take these agreements, which were being completely ignored, seriously at that point, which would just be like a monumentous miscalculation based on underestimating the insanity of the West, or the imperial ambitions of the West. And that's the only thing I could attribute it to, that this is like being just a massive miscalculation on Putin's part.
Yeah, well, I think there certainly were miscalculations. The Minsk Accords are obviously key to this. Again, most people, if you talk to the average person on the street and you talk about this, they don't know anything about the Minsk Accords, and yet the Minsk Accords basically are should be the resolution to this whole thing. I mean, the whole thing should never have started, of course. There should never have been this right-wing coup in 2014, but after the war started, quite shortly after, it was 2015, wasn't it, that these accords were signed. And what they did was they enabled an off ramp that would have worked very well, I think, for all sides. And basically, the war would have been ended. There would have been kind of, I don't know, sort of reconciliation. There would have been oversight from the OSCE, is it? And in fact, there was. And importantly, the Donbass region was basically going to be autonomous. So, or the two regions would be autonomous. So they would have their own rights, which basically meant that they would be free from further oppression from these extreme groups who'd taken power in Kiev at that time.
Well, that was to Putin's liking, right? Because people have been surprised by this, that Putin wanted the Donbass regions to stay in Ukraine at that time and not either become independent or join Russia. But the advantage is that he then has influence in Ukraine and has two provinces with this autonomy that can veto any decision to join NATO.
Yes, that's exactly it. So it served the interests of Europe at the time. I mean, Merkel and Hollande were very much involved in these negotiations, and it would have meant peace in Europe, basically. And like you say, from Putin's point of view, it would have basically represented a buffer, and it would have meant that Ukraine could not join NATO, which is obviously a concern. If you go back to the Soviet Union times, the Soviet Union had basically grabbed all the Eastern European countries as a buffer zone, essentially. That
their country had been marched into twice in the space of 25 years, and the latter time of those at the cost of 27 million Russian lives to repel the invaders. So it's something they were rather sensitive about, this big flat plain, because Russia doesn't have a good kind of geostrategic defense. It's not behind a mountain range or anything. The mountains are in Poland.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, where did that second invasion, or did that the invasion of the Second World War, Operation Barbarossa, where did it go through? Mostly it came through Ukraine, right? So it stands to reason that they'd be concerned about from fairly recent historical standpoint. I mean, people don't seem to keep in mind that many people in Russia will still remember this. It's not that long ago, or certainly have. So yeah, going back to why would you think that Russia would invade in last year when clearly they could end up in a dire situation where there's no real reason for the West not to keep supplying this proxy for a fight against them, basically. And they could be stuck there, like you say, like in a kind of equivalent to Afghanistan forever. And potentially that is the situation we're in. It's hard to, going back to what you were asking about, what do you think about the military pronouncements from people like Doug McGregor and Scott Ritter and Brian Beletic? I have to rely on them to some extent. I mean, I can't. I personally don't go on these Telegram channels to look at the evidence, because firstly I wouldn't know what I was looking at, but secondly it's kind of I'm quite sensitive to sort of violent images, so I try to avoid them. So you're reliant on basically two accounts, aren't you? Really, you've got the account of people who are kind of, and let's say anti-NATO, and you've got the account of the Western media, and you kind of have to judge the one against the other, don't you? Really, to kind of feel your way around what appears to be happening. Now, what I'd say at the moment is that clearly the West put a lot of emphasis on this, what they call a counteroffensive, which terminology is quite strange in itself, really, but let's call it counteroffensive. And they did, repeatedly say that basically they were going to try and push to Crimea, and that this, they were ambitious. They were going to get their pretty quickly, within days, really. And it's quite evident that what's actually happened is basically this front hasn't really moved for the last, certainly over, I think it's over 2 months, isn't it? And there's no sign that there's been any movement at all, really, to speak of, on as far, unless I'm missing something, of this counteroffensive. So it seems basically to have been a failure, and there does now appear to be a shift in the narrative from the West, basically admitting to some extent that this has been a failure.
Yeah.
There's a grave danger, isn't there, that the West just sees this as sort of all. And when I say the West, what I mean is, like, the West isn't one entity. I'm talking about the neocons in Washington, really, because they seem to be the ones, unfortunately, in the seat driving this. It seems like there's no end to the escalation for some of these people. You do wonder what their ambition is, really. Like, do they just want to end up, going to the ultimate extreme of, well, I don't even want to talk about it, really, but we all know where it could lead. Because can they afford to? And the other thing is, can they afford to lose? Can these neocons who've put so much into this? This isn't like pulling out of Afghanistan, which was kind of embarrassing, but people forgot pretty quickly. Some people are saying this would be the end of NATO and so on. Certainly, it would represent a sign that the empire is kind of losing the battle for primacy. Really.
Yeah, I don't see that as really hurting them. Let's say Russia took over a substantial chunk of Ukraine at the conclusion of this. I don't think anyone's going to be, oh, well, there's no point in having NATO now when a non-NATO country just got taken over right on NATO's doorstep. I can only see this leading to a strengthening of NATO, or in the opposite way, if Ukraine pushes every last Russian out of the country, then like, what a wonderful success for NATO, and Ukraine's not even a NATO member. So imagine, if they had been, what we could have done. I just think NATO is going to be strengthened either way by this.
Yeah, I mean, as a bystander on this, really, I see your point. Doug McGregor is very adamant that this is pretty much catastrophic for NATO, but he never actually explains why. I've got a lot of time for what he says about it, but he doesn't actually explain why. This is.
I'm not saying he's wrong. If you were in a sane world, like the idea that the US pumping all these weapons into Ukraine to make it a de facto NATO member and therefore sparking a conflict that's been more broadly sparked by NATO's advancement eastward, you could say, yeah, this is a disaster for NATO. If you consider NATO to be an alliance that is meant to keep Europe secure and the world at peace, then it's not a good sign. There's a massive war just on the borders of NATO prompted by NATO actions. But that's in a sane world. In like the insane world that neocons live in, it's a massive success for NATO. So I don't necessarily think he's wrong, but it's...
I mean, in a way, I have the same problem with when I look at all of these wars, because what these people do is they start wars and they never really, in inverted commas, win the wars. They just sort of create chaos. So, they did that in Afghanistan, they did it in Iraq, they did it in Syria, they did it in Libya, they're doing it in Ukraine. To some extent, you wonder, is this the idea, really? Is it just to create a mess? I don't know. I mean, with a mess, you can carry on selling weapons, and you can use these groups that you've backed to expand into other areas that you want to mess around with. And is this the ambition, or is this a sign of failure? Is it that they've got some plan to really seize total control of these places, but somehow they just keep messing it up?
Well, no, that is obvious. That's obviously what the goal was in Afghanistan, say in the 1980s, where neocons believe that they brought down the Soviet empire. They were quite willing to pay 1 million Afghan lives to achieve that. And that's what you're seeing in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian lives are completely expendable to this imperial goal of taming the bear.
Yeah.
So it's conceivable that one side collapses and that brings an end to this, or they run out of men or whatever, but it's also conceivable this just carries on for years into the future.
When they're at the most candid, they will tell you that this is a proxy war, not just to hobble Russia, but to divide it ultimately. They are. You can find the statements where they say these things. To get rid of the evil dictator Putin, because that will solve all the problems in the world, and secondly, then to divide it up, which is their real ambition, of
Yeah.
course. And yeah, I don't have any doubt that they really do see that as what they're aiming for. But it doesn't appear to me, at least, that they're even close to achieving that. I mean, it seems, and it is hard to judge, but it does seem that the Russians are riding this out far more successfully than they'd anticipated. And I mean, one of the things actually we haven't talked about is it's a financial attack, which was clearly sort of built into this, wasn't it, at the start? You know, that basically once they'd, as I see it anyway, once they'd kind of trapped Putin by getting him to come into this quagmire, essentially, then they were going to basically use that to go after the economy in every conceivable way. So, you know, massive attacks in sanctions and so on. And it just doesn't seem to have worked. I mean, as far as I can see, the Russian economy isn't really suffering at all from these sanctions, whereas we are, of course. And then, of course, you got the other thing that we haven't talked about, which is, you know, what's going on with the Nord Stream pipeline, which was clearly blown up by Western agents. I don't know precisely. Seymour Hersh says, I think he says it's Americans and Swedes, was it? I can't remember. And then they tried to gloss over that with this whole nonsense story about a yacht or whatever. And then they moved on because that story didn't sit. So they decided, no, we'll put the blame on the Ukrainians themselves. Which doesn't wash either, obviously, because the Ukrainians, let's face it, probably couldn't have orchestrated the attack. So basically we're left with, but because originally what we were told was that the Russians had blown up their own pipeline, which, I mean, it's incredible that they if we suggest for a moment that maybe the Americans wanted 9/11 to happen, that's conspiracy theory. But our news media will go all out to tell you that the Russians probably blew up their own pipeline, when that actually makes absolutely no sense whatsoever for a variety of reasons. One of which is they could just turn it off if they wanted to. You know what was that about, really? Well, apart from attacking Russia at an economic level, it was obviously an attack on Germany and the European Union, really, at an energy level.
Yeah, so you have this same pattern playing out for the past 100 years now, since Germany unified and became a global player, of playing it off against Russia.
Again, we haven't seen the full consequences of that action play out yet, I don't think, because, you know, the sort of the potential energy crisis that may affect us as well is kind of, if you like, pardon the pun, in the pipeline. You know, it's yet to get here, really, because we had quite a mild winter, didn't we? And, you know, and they'd already prepared and they already got stored gas. But my understanding is that it's going to be difficult to supply gas this coming winter. Well, that's why I heard a while ago people seem to stop talking about it. But what I find with these neocons is that when they do a project, when they run a project, they tend to have a lot of, what's the word, like irons in the fire or whatever. You know, there tends to be a lot of different kind of potential purposes for this single thing. So, you know, if we take I go back to 9/11 because it's inevitably where I always end up going back. It's clear that it was used to spark these religious wars, to enable imperialist expansion, war profiteering, and so on. But it was also used, you know, they signed the Patriot Act immediately after, so it was also to clamp down on civil liberties in America. Similar thing happened here. It was also used to bring in internet surveillance. You know, you've got Bill Binney talking about what happened at I think it was the NSA he was working for, wasn't it? Immediately in the shadow of 9/11, you've got all these changes taking place. So, I mean, 9/11 was obviously an enormous event. It was like a reset, I see it as. But to some extent, I think whenever the neocons are behind anything, which I presume they were behind that since they wrote the paper Rebuilding America's Defenses, they're certainly deeply involved in it anyway. You know, they're always thinking about, like, how can we sort of repurpose this or whatever, you know, like, so we can cause this grief in Ukraine, which will cause a problem for the Russians, and then, you know, when the war's kicked off, now we can kind of shut down energy supply to Europe, and that means that we can, well, I don't want to get too deep into this, but we can certainly supply our own liquefied gas potentially. So we gain advantage there. And also, of course, the other thing is that they've used it for is actually just shutting down voices. Just controlling the internet even more. Going back to what you were saying about COVID, obviously COVID was used as, again, had a variety of things that we were done under the excuse of COVID, and one of which was to shut down alternative voices massively. Same things happened with Russia, beginning with Russiagate, and now with this Ukraine war. It's just piled on, really. They just used it to tighten down on alternative voices even more. And I just yesterday I discovered that Scott Ritter had been taken down off YouTube. So whatever you think of Scott Ritter or any of these people, really, it doesn't matter to me. It's like, why is he not allowed to speak his mind on YouTube?
There's kind of a carryover, right? In that it's perhaps hard to imagine that happening had COVID not happened, but COVID obviously acted to normalize censorship. So Scott Ritter being taken down from YouTube doesn't seem like as big a thing as it would have felt in 2019, where it wasn't really normal to censor anti-war voices.
Yeah, I can slightly push back on that. I do agree with you, but I think it starts before COVID. I think you trace it back to Russiagate.
Right,
That's really where it begins. Because I started to notice it personally at that time, and I was writing about it at that
because
time.
Russiagate is an attack on democracy, and therefore it's dangerous to our institutions, and therefore needs to be stopped.
Yes,
I see.
Russiagate achieved a great many things that we're talking about again, really. I mean, as I saw it, Russiagate really began with the emails, the Clinton emails or the Podesta emails or whatever. It was a kind of, partly anyway, it was just an attempt to suppress that, really, like with the Hunter Biden laptop that happened more recently. But pretty soon it became a heightening of this sort of new Cold War, really, where basically they were just starting to shut down anyone who, it was McCarthyism, basically. It was just shutting down anyone who they viewed as saying the wrong things. And as you say, threatening democracy, essentially. That's how they would frame it. And then we got COVID. And COVID was obviously another tightening of the screw. So you had, you couldn't talk about so many different things, really. You couldn't talk about the origins of it. You couldn't talk about the masking. You couldn't talk about the use of alternative treatment. You couldn't talk about vaccines, obviously. It comes to something, doesn't it, where you cannot talk about medical procedures and stuff because that's somehow deemed a threat to almost national security. I don't know. But as soon as the war, the invasion started, the actual invasion in last year, we saw a massive block on, what they'd see as Russian propaganda. Well, fair enough. Okay, it probably is, I suppose. But Russia today is kind of Russian propaganda. But I thought we were like free. We're supposed to be a free society. We're supposed to rise above it, aren't we? Aren't we supposed to like allow these voices and then we just criticize them? But no, we actually just pull them off air.
Yeah, there's been a redefining of fundamental values along those lines.
Very much so, yeah. And I mean, we do live in strange times. I'm sure you have the same problem as me, where you kind of find yourself with most conversations, you can't talk about half the things you'd like to, because you'll either be considered, on the one hand, kind of slightly cracked, or on the other hand, basically evil. If you don't take the side of of Kiev on every point, then basically that makes you, like you say, you're kind of aligning yourself with Hitler, essentially, with Putin. Who is Hitler? Even though actually, the people who really support Hitler are actually often on the other side.
I don't get out much. I don't associate with people too much. You might wind me up that way.
Do you
I try
not?
and avoid it. Try my best.
I still like to have one foot in the world. So.
All right, James. I think we should probably wrap up at that point. If that sounds good to you.
That seems like, I don't know if you're going to edit it like that, but it almost seemed like an appropriate point.
These points arise, yeah. Okay, thanks very much for coming on, and I'll get you back on soon to talk about some of your other blogging and work and such.
Yeah. No, it's great to talk to you as always.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I enjoyed it.